Pastor here at Living Hope. I am so happy to be with you today, Living Hope. I'm joined today by my mom and my fiance and little brother, and so really happy they can join me today. This Christmas and this December, we've been in a series called The Promise of Christmas, and last week, Kirk talked about the promise of the light. And now this week, we're going to look at the promise of justice and how Jesus has brought justice to us and how he did that. I want to start off by telling you a story of something that happened to me that really changed my way, the way that I view justice, something that I witnessed. It happened in 2011. I went on an urban missions trip to the downtown east side in Vancouver. And if you didn't know anything about the downtown east side, it was one of the poorest neighborhoods in all of North America. And it was the downtown east side. People were living in poverty, and there was prostitution, and there's drug addicts. Our team went down there to kind of see, to kind of experience, and to kind of see what was going on. And we lived down there for a month, and we decided to raise funds for that and have a mission trip down there. One day, our team was escorted by a police officer just around the city. His name was Bob. He took us around the neighborhood to kind of show us what it looked like through his line of work as a police officer. And it really changed the way I saw justice. He took us down this alley, the team of 10 of us, and then we met this lady. She begins telling us her story. And she was this frail lady, and she's really dirty, and she looked like she'd been living down there for a long time. And she began telling us this story of how she lived in her apartment with her boyfriend. And because they didn't have heating in their apartment, they had to leave their side heater on all night. And what ended up happening was that her blankets caught fire. And her boyfriend didn't make it. He was engulfed by the flames. And she told us this story, and she said, this is why I'm down here. Like, the circumstances of my life, I ended up down here. I didn't have anyone else. And then she resorted to drugs. And then a while later, the policeman asked her to show us her arm. And she's just holding her arm just like this. And she looked like she was in a lot of pain. She rolled up her arm, and what we saw, our team saw, was this disfigured arm, so disformed, infected. And the police officer told us that because she's so addicted to the drugs, she had to keep using the needles in her arm and using a new vein every time. It just completely disformed her arm, and it was almost not functional. And so that experience was really difficult for our team. I remember we saw that, we were a little traumatized. We went back and we debriefed about it, and many of us didn't have words to say. We just sat in a circle, and the only response some of us had was to cry. It was a traumatic event, and I remember asking Jesus, why? Why did this have to happen? Was there nothing more that could be done for this lady? Like, it didn't feel like she deserved it. And I remember in that moment, it changed how I viewed justice. I saw that there's a lot of darkness in our world. And I was angry about it. And I was thinking about her situation and the things that I saw on my mission trip there. And it was bigger than I could imagine, the darkness that I saw. And I felt a little hopeless. What could be done for her and the people down in the downtown east side? How about us? Have you ever experienced injustice in your own life? Were there some things that happened to you or that you've seen that you just felt like was not right? Some of us today may have had stuff happen to us personally. Have you ever experienced injustice for your gender? Or maybe the color of your skin? I know I've been called certain names on the train because of the color of my skin. Have you ever been bullied at school or harassed at work? These are all injustices that we face, and I began to see it more with my eyes because of the injustice I experienced in the downtown east side. You see, we're not the first to experience injustice. In the text that we're going to look at today, in Isaiah, there was a people group called the Israelites that suffered the same injustice, some of the same injustices that we face today. They were forced out of their homes and taken into captivity by these great oppressive forces. And the forces destroyed their temples and forbid them from worshiping God. And so the Israelites too, they had felt this major injustice had been done to them. And just like when I was downtown Eastside, the Israelites felt angry and they felt hopeless because they were wondering when God was going to respond, when God was going to do something for them. And so the story we're going to look at is about the Israelites. But my hope, the point of the sermon today is that when we face injustice in this world, when we see injustices in our lives, I want us to know that we can turn to Jesus because Jesus will bring us true justice. Let me read from Isaiah 42. That's the passage we have today. Isaiah 42, 1-4, it says this: "Look at my servant whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one who pleases me. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or raise his voice in public. He will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. He will bring justice to all who have been wronged. He will not falter or lose heart until justice prevails throughout the earth. Even distant lands beyond the sea will wait for his instructions." Let me pray for us. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you that we can gather and we can worship together. We thank you that we can be in the presence of Jesus together. I pray that you would have a word for us today as you ready our hearts for what you have to say. And God, you know, God, there are people in this room today who have faced extreme injustices in their lives. And I cannot possibly imagine what they've gone through. But God, you know. And you know these people by name and their deepest hurts. And you have not left them. And so hear their prayers and touch their hearts today. And speak to us through this message. Amen. And so before we go on, we just read this passage in Isaiah. And Isaiah says justice a couple times in his prophecy. And so I want us to understand a little bit, what does he mean when he says justice? When he uses that word justice. You see, because in our Western culture, it's a little different from how Isaiah used it in his prophecy. In our Western culture, we have this dichotomy of justice, of guilt and innocence. You know, when someone does something bad, we send them to jail. An extreme example of this is the Justice League, a movie that just came out. You know, justice, does it look like this? You know, a fish man and a guy who runs really fast and a half robot, half man kind of person. Does justice look like that? Is that what Isaiah was talking about? In our Western culture, again, we have this dichotomy of guilt and innocence. And in Isaiah, when he was speaking about it, it's a bit more than that. And of course, they punished people who did wrong things. But when Isaiah spoke about it, it was about restoring dignity to God's people, to human beings. That when God created the world, everyone was made in God's image, and they intrinsically had value, you see. But because of sin and the things that happen in the world, there's injustice now. And now we face injustice because of the different power disparities, the gaps in powers, and the gaps in our resources. And so some people have a lot more power, and some people have a lot more resources, and we don't always share that power or share those resources. And so we may need these guys to come save us. But no, Isaiah talks about the injustices in the world as restoring dignity to God's people, to people in the world. And so you hear a lot in the Bible about these people groups called the widow and the poor and the foreigner. These are the people who are cast out in society, who because of sin, that now we have these disparities in our society. And because the people who had the power, they neglected them. That was what happened with sin. In a perfect world, everyone would have enough to eat. Everyone would have enough resources for themselves. And no one would be mistreated or criticized or bullied or harassed. But justice, Isaiah was speaking about, is caring, is having our concern for the widow, for the foreigner, for the orphans, for the poor, because God made everything to be right. And so that's what Isaiah was talking about when he uses justice. In Isaiah's prophecy, justice means restoring human dignity to God's creation. Restoring human dignity to God's creation. Before I went to the downtown east side, I would look at the people down there as like, oh, they deserve that, Or, I can't give them my money. Like, they're going to just use it for drugs and things like that. And I had these thoughts in my mind. But when I got to live down there for a month, I began to see these people had actual stories. And their stories lined up with me. They felt things like I did. They had the same experiences, but just because of some bad, unlucky events, they ended up where they were in the downtown east side. And so, in Isaiah's prophecy, justice means restoring human dignity to God's creation. That no one is meant to live in inequality. No one is meant to not have the same basic rights. And everyone is meant to live in equality. I just want us to imagine for a second us as being Israelites in that time. You are suffering, you're an Israelite, you're suffering all these injustices by the hands of these powerful nations around you, and you are angry. You are angry that you're beginning to lose hope in God. And then Isaiah speaks this prophecy to you. He speaks to you, and you begin to wonder. And when it talks about the true servant, you begin to wonder, who is this servant? When is he going to come? How is he going to bring this justice? As an Israelites, these are some of the questions that will be going through your mind about the true servant and how he's going to bring true justice. And so, looking back at the passage, it says, he will not shout or raise his voice in public. He will not shout or raise his voice in public. And so this true servant, as an Israelite, you're angry, you had this injustice faced upon you. You hear this, it says he will not shout or raise his voice in public. You're probably looking for someone who's a militant leader who can overthrow these people who have taken your home. And so this is a little kind of weird for you maybe. And then it says he will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. What does that mean? What is the weakest reed or the flickering candle? You see, if you're an Israelite and you heard this, you would know that the reeds and the flickering candle, they're kind of the same idea. The reed was these marsh reeds that just grew. They're everywhere, and they're really common, and they're indispensable. The reeds were used for flutes or for pens or measuring rods, a number of other things, and they could be found anywhere, but they were fragile, and they can be broken easily. And so a bruised reed or the weakest reed represented the weak and the helpless people in our world, in our society. The people that the world will quickly dismiss, would turn their face away, would not even think about. Similarly, the flickering wick was a nuisance. The Middle Easterners used this oil lamp in their homes, and when the oil runs out, the wick would create this dirty smoke, and it would just be a nuisance. It would be super annoying. It would fill up the room, and it wouldn't even produce that much light. And so the flickering wick, again, it would represent those people who are a nuisance to society, those that were cast aside, abandoned, and forgotten for whatever reason. So it's a similar idea. The weakest reed, the flickering wick, those are the people who are needy, who are broken. They're worn out and tired. They're exhausted with life's circumstances, and they were neglected by the world. And people will forget about them. But so the Israelites would hear this. They would hear, the true servant will not crush the weakest reed or put out the flickering candle. And that's how he's going to bring justice to those who have been wronged. And so that's what the Israelites are going to hear. And so they're looking for who this true servant can be. And then it says, he will not falter or lose heart until justice prevails throughout the earth. He will not lose heart or lose hope. In my situation in the downtown east side, injustice ran everywhere. It was bigger than I could imagine. And so there's times when I said, I don't think there can be anything done. But this true servant, he will not lose heart. He will not lose the hope until justice comes about. And then finally it says justice, even the distant lands beyond the sea will wait for his instructions. People everywhere will crave this justice. They want to know how we can live in harmony with each other. And so this is what the Israelites were looking for, the true servant who will single-handedly bring justice to all with his gentleness and compassion for those who are weak and forgotten. You see, some of the people believed it could have been Isaiah who prophesied this, or they could be speaking about King David, one of those kings who had brought their nation together and overthrew kingdoms. Some even believe it might be Israel, the nation themselves. But the point is, whoever it was, they had to fulfill these certain requirements of the prophecy so that it could become true. And the Israelites, they waited, and they waited. The Israelites had experienced extreme oppression and suffering by these powerful nations around them. And they waited for a Messiah in the form of this true servant that Isaiah spoke about, to liberate them and bring them justice, to alleviate this pain in their lives. But where would it come from? Who is this true servant? When would he come? And would God ever fulfill his promises of bringing a true servant to liberate them? I really wanted to dwell on this point because some of us in this room today could be asking the same questions to ourselves. We have experienced the pain of injustices. We are the victims of bad things happening to us by other people. And we ask the question, why? Why is this happening? When we weren't satisfied with the answers we were given, we began to wonder the same questions. When is justice coming for me? When will this madness stop and the horror end? The answers for the Israelites, it came 2,000 years ago in the town of Bethlehem, where a baby was born into a dirty manger. And this baby, he did not shout or raise his voice in public. He was born to poor parents that had nothing beautiful or majestic in their appearance, and there was nothing to attract people to this baby. Could he be the one to bring true justice? Does he fulfill the prophecy? Later in his life, we're going to look in Matthew. It talks about his baptism. And you can look with me and you help me tell me, does he fulfill the prophecy? It says in Matthew 3:13-17, it says, after his baptism, as Jesus came out of the water, the heavens were open, and he saw the Spirit of God descending on him like a dove and settling on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my dearly beloved Son who brings me great joy." Do you see any parallels with Jesus' baptism and Isaiah's prophecy? Later in Matthew Jesus is the answer. He comes and he proclaims Isaiah's prophecy over himself in Matthew 12:17-21. It says, this fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah concerning him. He says, "Look at my servant who I am chosen. He is my beloved," right? "Who pleases me." And like the dove in the baptism, it says, "I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will bring justice to be victorious, and his name will be the hope of all the world." And so Jesus comes out, he was born in this manger, and he makes these bold claims that he was going to bring justice. But he backs up these claims by walking into this prophecy and becoming the prophecy fulfilled. And so yes, indeed, Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecy, and he will bring justice to victory. Finally, right? If you're an Israelite, you'll be saying, finally, our hope has come. As the Israelite body, we can take a deep breath. Oh, yes, it came into being, and that our hope now has arrived. Jesus was a suffering servant, the one that everyone has been waiting for, the hope of the world. And from the time he walked on the earth, Jesus had changed the way that people approach justice. Now listen to this. This is how he had done it. He fed thousands of people who would later turn their backs on him and look the other way. He healed masses, even though they would later whip him and beat him. He would have done no wrong, yet he was despised and rejected by mankind. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. And this baby would go around teaching people about love and compassion for the poor, even though he was unjustly condemned on the cross. You see, Jesus, he brings about justice, but first he had experienced extreme injustice in his life. He was accused of things he had never done, and then he dies on a cross on our behalf. He responds with the utmost grace and humility. Why? It's because that's how he wants to bring justice into the world. That's how God planned it, that when God created the world, the injustice came because of sin, but Jesus brings injustice through the back door, not through force or assertiveness, but by taking the injustices and bringing it to the cross. You see, Jesus is the one who cares for the weakest reed and the flickering candle. He cares for the pains of the world, and so he cares so much that he suffered alongside of us, experienced injustice in his life. The people that have been cast out by society, he draws close to them, and he receives them with open arms, like the story of the prodigal son. The sinners, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the lost and the forgotten, and the neglected and the vulnerable. He wants to restore these people and make them whole again. And he addresses injustices in the world by taking them to the cross and dying for us. Now, because of Jesus, I can have hope for that woman that I met in the downtown east side. Because of what Jesus had done, Jesus had not forgotten her or had left her, right? She was the weakest reed and the flickering candle. Jesus came to die for her, and he brought hope for us all. Jesus was oppressed and treated harshly, and he was pierced and beaten and whipped for her. And Jesus came for you. Jesus' justice will take care of your pain and your suffering. He sees you, and he cares for you deeply for the injustices that you faced. And in the same way that Jesus answered the Israelites when they were waiting, when they were hoping, when Jesus, he answered them in the prophecy. Jesus is coming for us, and he's going to answer some of the injustices that we face. And he's came for you. So we can live in freedom, not bound to the things that happen to us. That when we face injustice, we can look to Jesus, we can look to the cross, and how Jesus is bringing justice to the world. And we can have hope. We can have hope that justice is victorious. Now, to conclude, what are we to do with this truth? What are we to do? Kirk last week, he talked about the promise of light. And so the last point is we can bring justice to the world by being light to people. We get to bring justice to people. In the same way we receive the gifts of grace from God, we too can be light to those around us. Relieving them of the injustices they face, or speaking on behalf of those who are voiceless. Feeding those who are hungry with freedom and care, and caring for the poor. Because of what Jesus has done, we have the freedom to do this. We have an opportunity to be light in the darkness, to be God's light, and to bring justice to the world, restoring human dignity to the people who do not have it, and making them whole again. And I have an illustration that Adele and I have an incredible friend. Her name is Jessie, and she's in Calgary. She's part of this great movement called Dressember. And so in this movement, she wears a dress every day in December to raise awareness for the unjust ways the fashion industry practices its businesses. And for a long time, the fashion industry has been connected to sweatshops, poor working conditions, and slavery. And so Jessie wants to raise awareness, and so she would post on Instagram and Facebook for this campaign. And on top of that, she tries to practice what she's preaching by wearing clothes that are fair trade or bought secondhand. Jessie is being a light. She's bringing justice to the world in the ways that she can, in her own power, carrying out Jesus' mission for the world. You see, Jesus brings justice for the Israelites. Jesus brings justice for us today. And then he hands over his mission to the church, to the people of God, to say, go, bring justice to the nations. And so those who love him, those who believe in him, those who follow him, we can carry this mission. We can run with what Jesus has taught us about loving and caring for the needy and for the poor and the forgotten. Because he has taught us how to do so. He taught us how to love our neighbors. He taught us how to turn the other cheek when we face injustices, take it to the cross. And ultimately, he taught us how to lay down our lives for others. And he modeled this to the maximum extent when he died on the cross. And so during this Christmas season, would you just take a moment and pause and see the ways how you can carry out Jesus' mission and bring the promise of justice for the world? Imagine with me for a moment what it would look like if we started changing the culture in our workplaces and in our schools. How justice would look like if we modeled it the same way Jesus did. That the things that we face, we can take it to Jesus because we know that God cares for the world and that he's working things into his plan. You see, we have power. We have power to influence. We have power to change. In the way we vote, for example, are we voting people into power who are perpetuating this systems of injustice or alleviating some of the needs and the cause of the forgotten, the poor? In the way we spend our money, just like Jessie wants to spend her money and her on secondhand things because she intentionally doesn't want to support the things that are not fair trade. We can spend our money in wise ways that, again, does it perpetuate systems of injustice or does it alleviate those who are needy and forgotten and poor? And finally, in the ways we can bring justice by the way we raise our children, by teaching them to love people who are different from them, who are not the same as them, and teach them, and even how we discipline them. Are we treating them with fairly? Are we apologizing when we make mistakes? And so we can be people of the light, of God's light, bring justice to the world.